Welcome to the Saugatuck-Douglas History Center's May virtual meeting, Saugatuck's Big Pavilion in Art. I'm Eric Gollannek, your host and the director of the Saugatuck-Douglas History Center. This program was recorded on May 13, 2020. The mission of the Saugatuck-Douglas History Center is to preserve local history and inspire learning to inform and improve our community. Founded as the Saugatuck-Douglas Historical Society in 1986, we are a volunteer-driven organization 700 members strong that saves and shares the story of our lakeshore community. We want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors. This activity is supported by the Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. Funding for these programs has also been provided by Michigan Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities, or NEH, as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security CARES Act Economic Stabilization Plan. Support from the Allegan County Community Foundation Legacy Grant also underwrites our operations. We also rely on the support of our members. To become a member, join online at www.mysdhistory.org. This program looks back at the history of Saugatuck's Big Pavilion, built in 1909 and destroyed by fire May 6, 1960. This is a look back at the 60th anniversary of the loss of the Big Pavilion. I'll pass the program over now to SDHC board member and collection manager, Ken Kutzel.
This is a graphic of the Big Pavilion that was used in a lot of advertisements in the 1940s. The Big Pavilion, an exhibit of images. In 1909, the Big Pavilion was constructed on the Kalamazoo River in Saugatuck. The largest dance hall in Michigan, it soon became known as the Brightest Spot on the Great Lakes. The massive structure hosted some of the biggest names in music, and guests flocked to visit, arriving by steamer, interurban, and car. It also had a movie theater at its south end and bars and coffee houses in the lower level. The pavilion became synonymous with Saugatuck. On May 6, 1960, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the great landmark. To this day, the Big Pavilion remains one of the great symbols of Saugatuck and the era of the big bands, even though it has lived only in memory for the past 60 years. The artworks in this exhibit are a representation of how artists reacted to the structure itself and to the collective memory of this icon. There is no intention for this to be a comprehensive study of the history of the Big Pavilion, but instead it is an opportunity to delight, share, and remember. Here we have a poster that was done for 1942. We don't know who made it, and it's a poster and it's mixed media. If you look closely, well, you can't really see it here, but if you saw this in person, you would see that some of the letters are cutouts. Part of it is silk screen. And I think that the silk screens were done, and probably the letters could be added on for whatever was going on. This poster survived inside of a wall. It was actually in the 1892 house, and during a remodeling, it was found inside of a wall. Here we have a membership card. Apparently you could pay a yearly membership. This was in 1954, and H.W. Till had a card that let him in. The interior of the Big Pavilion was really spectacular. Here we have an image from around 1920. And one of the things, this is a postcard, I did discover that the linen postcards really came out in the 30s. And a lot of these postcards in the 30s used images that were taken earlier on. Notice that there were palm trees growing in the pavilion, You can see the dance floor in the center, and then there was a promenade all the way around. Here we have another interior image, and this actually would be in the 1930s. What you see hanging, the little flags, would be the call numbers of radio stations. A lot of the programs or concerts from the Big Pavilion were broadcast all over the United States. And here we have a sort of a close-up of the Big Pavilion stage around 1920. And you can see all of the lights around the top of the stage. It actually is quite impressive. Here's another interior shot. You can see the big arches along the ceiling way. And it's kind of wonderful. This again would be a linen postcard of an earlier image. And it's kind of wonderful to, when you see the two men standing there, you get an idea of the size of the building, which actually was almost equivalent to an 8-story building. Here we have a harvest. The pavilion was open, and we have, you can see that people are all dressed up, and you see the palm trees and the dancing. It was really a pretty fancy thing when one was there. Here we have a painting that was done by John Polka, who was a Saugatuck resident, and he lived from 1930 to 2006. A lot of you probably remember him. This is a very impressionistic view that would have been done after the pavilion was already gone. You can just see it. It's sort of like, you don't know if it's morning because you would be looking east here. You kind of see the red in the sky, or if that's just a device. But he does a wonderful job with it almost looking like a mirage because it's not there anymore. Very loose brush strokes. He really manipulates the color in this. And here we have a photograph of the Big Pavilion at Night, and it was famous for all of the lights that were on the outside. This kind of is wonderful, the way it captures the light coming from the inside, and this would be looking at the north end of the building. Here's a picture from 1909 of the Big Pavilion under construction. And this is kind of a rare image. It's wonderful to see the scaffolding. And obviously you're looking from the water side, and you can see the butler in the background. And here, circa 1915, you have a steamer that is pulled up to the, this would be again the north end of the Big Pavilion. And you can see obviously the old car in front and the stairway, which was the original configuration for for entering the building. Later on, the stairway was taken out and you entered from Water Street. Here is a drawing done by Wilfred Berg from Muskegon, and Wilfred actually is probably Muskegon's best known artist. Several years ago, we were given 14 of these drawings from the Lakeshore Museum Center. And these really are wonderful, the way he loosely captures. This would be the pavilion from across the river. You're looking at the north end of it again. It's kind of wonderful here. If you look toward the right at the end of the building, you can see the back end of the movie theater. And these were all done with marker on paper. And here we have another view of the north end, the north side of the Big Pavilion, with the yachts in the harbor there. This is a watercolor by Cyrus Doherty, and Cyrus Doherty visited Saugatuck in 1916, and it would be right after the pavilion opened. It had just been open a couple of years. It had gained quite a reputation for being something that one had to see. He was here on his way to World War I, and he did this painting while he was here. It's possible that he actually did it from life, but I have seen postcards that were similar to this very image, and he may have used that as a guide. We don't know for sure. The story is that Cyrus kept this with him his whole life, and it came to us after his death through the estate. And here are some photographs that were taken on that trip when Cyrus Doherty was here in 1916. You have a nice early view of the pavilion on the left. In the center, you have a picture of Cyrus, who was an artist who had studied at the Chicago Institute. And on the right, on the far right in the photo, you see Cyrus sort of leaning against that trolley or whatever it is. And it's just a wonderful, well, you would get from the downtown out to the pavilion. Here we have a Marianne Perry watercolor, and Marianne Perry was a founding member of the Grand Valley Artists, which formed in 1957. And the image here captures the little park which existed on the backside of the pavilion, sort of south to the Butler. And this is always, to me, the more interesting side of the pavilion, because it's sort of like a private view of it. And here you can see some people that are just really enjoying themselves, sitting down by the water and in the peace and quiet there. It's kind of interesting that there's all this peace right next to Saugatuck's wildest venue. And here we have a photo about 1950 of the big pavilion with some of the yachts on the side there. I think this gives you a real good idea of how tall the building was. And here again is an early view of the pavilion. You see the ladder there. I don't know if they're still finishing up building or not. If you notice, though, there's a very interesting car in the lower left, which really, again, helps to date it. And the steamer sort of pulled up. You can see it's kind of muddy in front, so it looks like they really aren't finished with it. And here we have the big pavilion from on the south side. That little smokestack that you see would have been the powerhouse, the chimney for the powerhouse, which created the electricity for the lights. Later on, and that would have been early on. Later, when lights came to Saugatuck, they didn't need to generate their own power anymore. And here we have this is an image of the Coral Gables on the left, and of course the Butler on the right. The area between the Coral Gables and the Butler is where the pavilion stood. And this sort of is an interesting view of how different the waterfront began to look once it was gone, once the pavilion was gone. Here we have a promotion card from 1909 that sort of showed what the pavilion was going to look like. And obviously, those of you that are more familiar with it, it didn't end up looking exactly like this, but quite a bit like it. This photo actually looked a little bit more like an earlier pavilion that was built in South Haven by the same guys that built the big pavilion here in Saugatuck. Here we have an Ellen Lanyon watercolor, and Ellen Lanyon was a well-known figure out at Oxbow every year. And when she studied here in the 40s, she did this watercolor of the backside of the pavilion. And it again is one of my favorites because I just love that private view. You got a guy in there you don't on the right. You don't know if it looks like he's painting or maybe doing a little bit of cleanup work. And if you notice toward the left, there's a guy sort of lying down under a tree. But again, you get this wonderful juxtaposition of of the wildest place in West Michigan, and this serenity right behind it there. And the building always was red. Here we have a view of the north side again of the Big Pavilion around 1910. And it's wonderful with the little interurban that would come from Holland and bring people from the Makatawa area so that they could dance at the pavilion. And here we have another view, 1909, the Big Pavilion under construction. This is a really neat photo. And earlier I mentioned that Cyrus Doherty may have used a postcard. If you notice to the far right here, that little boat sticking out appears in Cyrus Doherty's painting of this. This also is a neat postcard because it actually talks a little bit about the pavilion. And it was 320 feet long, 110 feet wide. It was 68 feet from floor to ceiling, and it had 3,200 electric lights. That's why it was called the brightest spot. All right, here is another Ellen Lanyon, and this is actually of the north side of the pavilion. And this is the more traditional way of showing the pavilion. It really dominated the waterfront, and you can kind of see it here. No matter what, it's always kind of used as a centerpiece. On the left side, we see part of the Coral Gables, which is still there. And again, Ellen Lanyon was very, very active in the area here and with Oxbow. And here's just kind of a weird postcard of the pavilion. It almost looks like a negative image, but it's, I think it was probably a souvenir of some kind. And here again, we have the Coral Gables and the Big Pavilion. Another view with, it's always interesting with the boats. And here's the Big Pavilion, probably around 1955. And this is kind of an interesting photograph because, you know, it's starting to look a little bit worse for wear. The old girl is just kind of, she's got graffiti all over the side. And this is, you know, toward actually when she burned. I mean, it's interesting when you think that the pavilion only stood really for about 50 years. Again, notice on the far right, you can see the back of the movie theater. And I really like this photo because it shows that real well. This is an Edna Hotchkiss of the Chain Ferry. And you can see the way the view from the Chain Ferry toward the pavilion is always dramatic. And the painters from Oxbow would often come and paint along the riverfront. You've got the Chain Ferry in the foreground here, and it's a wonderful sort of lazy afternoon here. You can see that the ferryman here is sort of almost sleeping on the side here, and the passengers want to cross. In this period, most of the activity in Saugatuck really took place between the pavilion and the Chain Ferry. We don't really know much about Edna Hotchkiss except that she was present at Oxbow every year from 1919 to 1940. And there is a cottage out at Oxbow that bears her name, but that's all we know about her. Here again is a photo, circa 1915, of what the Chain Ferry looked like. With this one's pretty loaded. And a view of the pavilion from Mount Baldhead. This is kind of wonderful. It's interesting the way the pavilion, you kind of see it the way it's on a point. And then when you look back, you can see across to Douglas. It's just a very, very interesting view. And of course, if you look at the other buildings, there's a lot of empty space at this point on the waterfront. Here is the view of the Saugatuck waterfront, probably in the 30s, and you can see the pavilion in the background. And again, it just dominates the landscape. This is a painting that was done by Martha Dean Sievert, and she studied at Oxbow and at the University of Pennsylvania. She did a lot of traveling in her life, and she was well known locally for a whimsical poster map that she did of the Saugatuck area. And here she uses different paint application techniques to enhance the perception of different kinds of texture and surface. The image here, and it may have been done from a postcard, but it almost has a coloring book look that gives it an incredible charm. And again, you can see the movie theater on the back of the south end there. And here's a view that's much like the Martha Sievert from the water. And another, view toward the end with all the graffiti on the side, which is kind of sad to see. She looks like she needs a paint job here. Here's a Cora Bliss Taylor, and in fact, there's currently an exhibit up at the museum when we open back up called Cody's World. Cora was born in Cincinnati in 1889, and she spent a lot of her childhood traveling around the United States. She was actually very well traveled for her time. She visited Saugatuck in 1914 on her honeymoon, and just decided that she wanted to move here. In 1931, she founded the Taylor Art School, a summer art school with visiting instructors on Holland Street in Saugatuck. And as she was also the art director of the Saugatuck Chamber of Commerce and was instrumental in attracting many Chicago people to the Saugatuck area. She continued to teach painting to children for many years, and she's probably in sort of the history of Saugatuck, one of the most beloved citizens, I would say. Here's a view from Mount Bald Head, and interestingly, this is kind of neat because you're looking through trees. So basically, in the middle left, you see the pavilion. It's wonderful because you can kind of see the bridge in the background, and it's actually the old bridge, not the new bridge. And then you have the Mount Bald Head Hotel over on the left. And this is kind of a really interesting view because you're just looking like at a couple main attractions, and it's like the city isn't there. And here is another waterfront view from Mount Bald Head. In the very center here, you can see what was the roller rink. And actually that was a pavilion that was also a dance pavilion that was built right before the Big Pavilion and had to switch over because the Big Pavilion just really took over. Here we have an Edgar Yeager painting, almost cubist, entitled Old Saugatuck. And if you notice, it is kind of wonderful. In the background, you've got the bridge. The new bridge went in 1936. So in a way, he's sort of looking back in 1937 to the way it looked before. And Edgar Yeager was born in Detroit in 1904. He was very prolific, and he mastered virtually every medium. He's credited with being one of the first American modernists. And in fact, he entered works into an exhibit or into a contest where Cézanne was the judge. And in 1930, I'm sorry, that was Matisse. But he admired Jaeger's sophisticated knowledge and application of color. He was influenced by a lot of the modernists. And here you have the big pavilion from atop Mount Baldhead. He took some liberty with the composition. He leaves a lot of things out in that. And the dead tree in the foreground seems to lament the occurring change in Saugatuck as it becomes somewhat less picturesque. It is really not known whether Jaeger was a frequent visitor to the area or not. Okay, and here we have another view of the big pavilion from the other side. You can see the little Queen of Saugatuck, or whatever the name was at the time. And here we have the Saugatuck waterfront sort of in the 20s. Here we have a John Polka, the Big Pavilion at Night. And John Polka, again, we mentioned earlier, studied in Europe and at Oxbow, and he opened a studio in the 60s. He was really known for doing landscapes, people, and animals. And Polka did several versions of the Big Pavilion. This one is very moody and was painted 5 years after the pavilion burned. The viewer's perception of the image changes as the light of the passing day moves across the room. The water seems to glow in front of the building, capturing the lost splendor of Saugatuck's great icon. Really kind of a wonderful, wonderful view, and even the mast from the little sailboat in the front sort of points right to the building. And here we have a postcard of the Big Pavilion at Night. Again, it really interesting. If you look to the left, you can see an interurban coming with the lights on, and that's really an interesting element in this photo. And also on the very far right, in the car, you can see the headlights are lit. And that's kind of a neat little detail. Here we have a Francis Chapin lithograph of the movie theater at the backside of the pavilion. And Francis Chapin was born in Bristolville, Ohio. He attended the Art Institute of Chicago. From 1929 to 46, he was a teacher at the Chicago Art Institute. And from 41 to 46, he directed their summer school at Oxbow and Saugatuck. He also taught at the John Herron Art Institute, at the Indianapolis Art Museum, and the University of Georgia. Chapin was dubbed the Dean of Chicago Painters in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. This work captures a summer evening outside the theater, which was attached to the south end of the Big Pavilion. Chapin uses negative space to create light emanating from the interior of the theater. And Chapin's kind of known for those kind of squiggly people, and that they're really kind of fun. This is very typical of his work. Here we have another view. This is a kind of a neat view of the pavilion, because you're looking on the left here, you're looking at the entrance to the theater, the movie theater, and you can see the cars that are parked on Water Street. So this is actually a street side view, and these are a little more rare. And here we have another view of the backside of the pavilion. This is before the little park would have been put in. And again, to the right, you can see that smokestack from the energy plant to run the lights. And here's a view from Douglas, and you're looking at the Butler sort of in front of the pavilion. Kind of an interesting view with Mount Baldhead in the background. If you look carefully at the top of Mount Baldhead, you can see that little tower that used to be up there, the one that you would climb. And here's a very unusual sort of almost nighttime view of the Big Pavilion from Douglas. It's kind of wonderful with the little guy in the boat almost not looking at it, looking away from it. And some of you may remember Terra Restaurant. This is a photo of the view from the restaurant looking across toward, this will be across Blue Star, toward the big pavilion. You can see it, the pavilion in the background there. One of my favorite things in this photo is that 7-Up sign on the right, just kind of a fun little detail. And I don't remember Terra, but the people that do all say the same thing, that it was quite a place. Here we have another Wilfred Berg, and this is one of those little marker drawings. And this would be that same view that you saw from Terra, looking across Lake Kalamazoo to the big pavilion. You almost can feel the wind here, suggested by some of the diagonals in the foliage, and that it just almost makes you feel like autumn is in the air. Here you have another view of the big pavilion viewed from Douglas. This is kind of neat the way it's framed by the trees around it, and kind of an unusual one because you really don't see the butler at all. Here is a Peggy Boyce, Boats on the Kalamazoo, Oil on Board. And here Peggy sort of captures what a summer really looks like here in the area with the boats moored. And again, you look in the background and you can see the butler and the pavilion sort of just sitting there. Peggy was raised in an artistic family. Her grandmother was an early member of the Saugatuck Art Association, and her mother studied at Oxbow. When her 8 children were all in school, Peggy returned to Grand Valley State University to obtain a teaching certificate. She taught art at West Ottawa High School in Holland from '73 to '94. In addition to painting, Peggy works on paper making, weaving, and jewelry design. This image captures a marina on the Douglas side of the Kalamazoo Lake. And again, in the distance, we see the pavilion. Here's a very interesting view of the pavilion. You can kind of see it over in the left. And boy, I have to ask Jack Sheridan about this, but I think this most likely is Campbell Road, where we are, because Perryman Road would have looked right at the pavilion. So I think this is Campbell Road, which looks very different now. There are a lot more trees. And here is a Francis Chapin watercolor. This is kind of wonderful because it's sort of from the Douglas side and shows the boats kind of pulled up onto the land and the pavilion in the background. Again, you get to see Chapin's real loose brushwork and all of his squiggly lines. And here we have the big pavilion again. This is actually looking down on the Saugatuck side, actually, and on the left is most likely the in front of the Mount Baldhead Hotel, which is now the Ship and Shore. Here we have Rosemary Sheffield Taft, and this is a oil pastel on paper. Rosemary, he had a shop in Saugatuck, and my understanding is she sold art on one side and her husband sold antiques on the other. But anyway, this probably was done from a postcard. She did a lot of these these oil pastels, and they're kind of fun. And here we have the Saugatuck waterfront. This is a nice clear image. Obviously you can see where the pavilion is with the boat dock right next to it. If you look in the background, you can see the swing bridge, and that's one of the things that I like the most about this photo. And here we have another Francis Chapin. This is an oil on panel. This work kind of captures the Big Pavilion at night. And here Chapin has really taken some liberty with the compositions, and he simplified the waterfront so that there really are fewer buildings than in here than actually exist. It's almost a Japanese perspective. It's sort of an inverted Y to get, and that's what was used in woodblock prints. There's a sparse use of white paint, and that sort of deepens the illusion of the darkness of night. Here we have a really, really rare photo of the Sewards, and I know one is Rube. I don't know who the other one is, but, and this is taken from a stereoptic view. And here they are standing at the water's edge, and of course you have the Big Pavilion in the background. Kind of a wonderful photo. This here is a painting that was done by Hilda Reuben Pierce, and this is a very, very interesting painting. Hilda Reuben was from Europe. She came in during that Holocaust era. She had studied with Kokoschka in Austria. And when she came here, she went to Chicago and obviously came to Saugatuck and painted. This is really a very, very modernist style. And I also found out that Hilda Reuben was very active selling in the Jewish community in Detroit. There were some of the galleries on the west side that featured a lot of the people that had come from Europe, and she was real well known in that circle. Here we have a Bill Simmons photograph, the Big Pavilion, Lake Kalamazoo, and it's just wonderful. This shows the water side of the pavilion, and actually at the left here, the very left, you can see the entrance to the dock, which was the restaurant underneath the pavilion. And again, the people in the photo really help to get an idea of scale and how tall the building was. Bill Simmons moved to Saugatuck in the 40s to pursue his hobby of photography, and he actually made it his living. He had a studio on Butler Street, and he did portraits by appointment. He developed film for tourists, and he matted and framed photographs of the area. He also created postcards. At different times, he was an editor for the Commercial Record, Saugatuck's local newspaper. And you know, this just shows a typical day on the water in front of the pavilion and really how busy it was. This here is a birdhouse that was created by Dan Sigler, who is actually a member of the History Center. And as a child, he was fascinated with Lincoln logs and Tinker toys. So it's not surprising that his works are sort of reminiscent of these bygone days. He's rather new to the world of art. He's a retired attorney now, and he began creating these quirky pieces for personal use and as gifts. And only when his interest in his pieces began to grow did he begin to take his hobby seriously. He works with found items. He creates objects intended to evoke memories of special events or past eras. This sculpture captures the magic and mystery of Saugatuck's greatest icon, the Big Pavilion, which we know was destroyed by fire. And here we have a postcard of the Pavilion Burning. This would be May 6, 1960. And you're actually looking at them fighting the fire down at the movie theater end, which would be the south end. And here is another Simmons photo. And this is really the end of an era. This is the Big Pavilion Burning. This is a very special image. If you look closely at it, it's one of those instances where something that was an error or was unintended made something a masterpiece. This is actually a double exposure. And what we believe happened with Simmons was he kept photographing and went through, and so he had photographed some of the images over another one. And if you look in the front here, you get sort of, you can see an image of a fire truck. And if you look over to the right behind the phone booth, there's a sign that was actually on the movie theater side where there was a little cafe. So this is, it turns out that it's sort of a hodgepodge of views all happening, and it sort of represents the chaos. It's a marvelous photo. And I want to thank you for joining me. It was kind of fun putting this together. This is sort of a prototype for you know, what we hope to do with other exhibits that we've done. And I just want to finish up by asking if anybody has information on either John Ogren or Nels Osterberg. I would really appreciate any information you can share. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Eric. And again, really thank you for joining us this evening.